So thank you everyone for joining us today. We're from the Allen Institute, and this is Behind the Scenes of Science, a webinar for students like you to learn about career paths in science. My name is Caitlin. I'm going to be helping out today while you talk to Jamie, who is an engineer at the Allen Institute for Cell Science, a division of the Allen Institute. So again, please go ahead and put any questions for Jamie into that Q&A here in Zoom, and we will have plenty of time to take those. But to get us started, Jamie, do you want to tell us about your science journey from high school to now?
Okay, sure. So when I started, I grew up on the East Coast, and when I started, I gravitated towards math and physics and biology in high school, and did AP Bio, AP Chem, AP Physics, and calculus. And calculus was kind of transformative for me because it was I'd struggled in sections of math before then, and then I hit calculus, and it was this kind of way to explain the world, right? Like there's a bunch of problems like, shifting light, the shadow a light post casts and how fast it moves and those kinds of things. And that kind of started to get me really interested in representing the world mathematically. And so when I finished high school, I went to Caltech for undergrad, and I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. So I bounced through probably 11 majors or something like that. Everything from physics to applied physics to optics to chemical engineering. And what I kind of, what I settled on and what I really realized I enjoyed after a while was applied math. And so I did that became my focus of my undergrad studies. And even in high school, my two major interests were like biology and applied math and mathematics, essentially, and trying to see how to connect the two. And so in undergrad, I focused on applied math, but I took a lot of classes in other disciplines and ended up doing an independent study on mathematical biology. And then, and so once I finished undergrad and got my bachelor's, I looked at grad school, and I ended up going to University of Washington for applied math. And I came to work with a guy named Sir Jim Murray, or James Murray. And he's actually a knight, which is kind of interesting. And then, and he's also fairly famous within that space of like mathematical biology. He's written one of the seminal textbooks on the topic. And things about how do patterns form on an animal's coat, how do tumors grow, how do you like one of the projects we worked on there was tumor resection, and like when with a really aggressive tumor form a brain tumor, can you successfully cut it out? When do you have to detect it for that to be like effective without taking too much tissue out? Things that were kind of fun. And then kind of bounced around a bit and ended up, he had health issues. And so I ended up taking a master's degree because he wasn't going to be able to be involved in my thesis work. And then, so I took a master's degree and transferred and did a PhD in molecular biotech, working on proteins and biological mass spectrometry. Sorry.
And you transferred to a different program at UW, right?
At UW, yeah. So I did my
PhD.
PhD.
Same institution.
Sorry, yes, same, still at UW, but in mathematical biology, sorry, in molecular biotech, which is now genome sciences. Sorry, did I address the question? Okay.
And then you came from UW to the Institute, is that right?
Yeah, so how did I get to the Institute? So yeah, after my PhD, I ended up working at a national facility in Australia and doing protein analysis. And I was essentially combining my two backgrounds of biotech and math to do protein identification, and worked in that space for quite a while as kind of as senior scientist of bioinformatics there. And then I did a postdoc at UCSF. And then I was an assistant, the title wasn't exactly this, but essentially an assistant professor at University of Sydney. and then back in Australia for a few years, and then went to work for industry for a few years for a company called SciEx that builds mass spectrometers in their R&D department. And the space that I worked in was protein identification algorithms. So how do you turn mass spectrometry data into unknown, like how do you know what you saw? Like, was it this protein or that protein? And then after I published in that space, worked in that space for quite a while, and then an opportunity to work at the Institute came up, at the Allen Institute came up. And it's kind of going back to kind of the mathematics basics and trying to represent things. So I took a position here working as an engineer. And I have some projects that are more scientific, like that are essentially blue sky research as opposed to engineering. So I kind of play in both spaces now.
Can you explain what blue sky engineering means?
Well, blue sky research, I mean.
Blue sky research.
Yeah, so just meaning they're more investigative questions. There aren't well-known answers, and you're trying to figure out how this works, how it behaves. So one example of the projects that we're playing with at the moment that's kind of investigative is the nucleolus, which is an organelle within the nucleus. And it's a really interesting one because it's essentially, when you look at matter, there are different phases of matter. This is a lot of organelles in the cell have a membrane. This doesn't. It's essentially like an oil droplet. And during some parts of the cell cycle, it dissolves and breaks up. And in other parts, it coalesces. And so you have this droplet physics phenomenon going on that drives this organelle. And the main purpose, or one of the main functions of this organelle, is to create ribosomes, which are involved in taking RNA and turning it into protein. So it's kind of a crucial function. So it's kind of interesting to see, so that's an example of, we don't really know how it works and we're trying to figure it out. So, yeah.
Yeah, it can feel from textbooks like we know everything about how cells work and what all of their parts are and what they do, but there's still a lot left to learn at this fundamental research level that we're working on.
Definitely. It's like one of the interesting things I was told by a professor when I was at Caltech was the reason why we have undergrads, because they're well funded. They don't have to necessarily teach, but they choose to. And they said one of the reasons why we have undergrads is because that they don't know that they can't walk through the walls. And what that means is that we think the world works this way, and we've gotten there through assumption sometimes, or things get extrapolated. And sometimes that's not actually how it works. And so if you're intellectually curious and you go after something and you try something, even though you're not an expert, you might be considered by some to be naive, sometimes you can have a genuine breakthrough.
Yeah, I've seen some really exciting experimental concepts come up with by high schoolers because they just go for it. You just go with where your curiosity takes you. Yeah. So now you are at the Allen Institute. You've gone on this journey from high school to now. What does an average day look like for you as a scientist, both before the pandemic and now?
So during phases of my career, I've done a lot of wet lab work. So growing cells, working with instrumentation. At the Allen Institute, I'm more in a engineering modeling role where I work predominantly on a computer. So most of my time is spent either reading and thinking, or writing code, or doing math on a piece of paper. And so that's the bulk of what I do, which isn't particularly exciting to watch, but you can have some really cool results, and the outcome of it can be a lot of fun.
So it hasn't changed very much because you weren't physically in the lab very much at all, actually.
Yeah, not at the Allen Institute.
Yeah.
In grad school, yes, but not for a while.
Well, this question then can encompass both your whole time at the Institute. What is your favorite thing about your job?
I think the thing I like about it the most is that I get to be intellectually curious. I get to ask a lot of questions and kind of learn more from people. And, like you have presentations where somebody's a leading expert or knows a lot about a topic, and it pays to speak up and ask. Just like, oh, I'm curious about this, or some aspect of it, and I really encourage that. So that's my favorite thing. And then there's freedom to be intellectually curious, to chase things. You can spend some portion of your time reading up on new discoveries, new topics, that kind of stuff. And it's part of, you have to stay current. So that's how you do it.
As a reminder, we have plenty of time for questions from you in our audience. So please go ahead and use the Q&A button here in Zoom down in the footer of the window to ask those questions. And before we start getting to those, science doesn't always work right. You have to go on adventures, and sometimes things happen on the progress to learning more. What has been your best science failure? Whatever that means. Best learning experience, funniest, most surprising.
So one is actually when a colleague I was working with asked me a question, and the question had to do with protein identification. And it was essentially, the way this works is you take a protein and you smash it apart with a gas, and you look at the masses that come out. And people were trying to use these fragments as identifiers, right? To say, oh, I saw this mass, and hoping it was diagnostic for that protein. But it's a pretty dense space. And so the question I was asked was, how diagnostic is that? How much information is in that one fragment? So I went in and did a simulation in terms of all the proteins in the human proteome, meaning all the proteins that we know of that a cell makes, and computationally generated fragments from them, and then said, how diagnostic is it? And the answer turned out to be not very much at all, right? And so that was kind of that's a bummer. But then I went back and thought about it for a bit. And, so stubbornness is not a bad thing in science all the time, or at least, wanting to see a solution in something. And so I went back to it and thought about it for a while. And eventually it dawned on me that the information content, like where the information was in this fragmentation data in these masses, wasn't in the actual mass values, but was in pairs of them, right? And that I could then went back and ask the question, well, how many combinations of fragment masses would I need to see in order to have a one-to-one mapping between the pattern and the number and a protein, right? And answer turned out to be somewhere between 3 and 4 in the case that I was working on, or in the example that I was working with. And that ended up leading to a new identification framework, like a whole new algorithm and methodology, which was arguably like the newest contribution in the field in that space for probably 20 years. So that was a big deal. And setbacks are not necessarily a bad thing. Especially if you take the time to back up and think about them, and why, if your gut's telling you that there's information there or there's something there, listen to it and just try and back away from the problem and think about it more. Yeah.
Well, we have time now for a couple of questions from our audience. So the first one is, what do you think is the most important part of your work in science?
I think, so the most important part of work in science, I think for me personally, it's contributing to the collective knowledge of humans, right? Like what we know. And so that's a big deal to me. It always has been something that I valued. And so being able to, to make small, even if they're small contributions or part of larger projects, as a scientist, you end up working on or an engineer, you end up working on a lot of different projects in supporting roles, sometimes in leading roles, but each of those is of value. So, yeah.
What are the skills that you use in a daily basis in your work?
So a lot of the work I do, I So I do a lot of software development. So I work in C++ and Python a lot. I would say that the crucial component of those is of working in that space is asking questions. Yeah, like thinking about what you're trying to do, backing away from the problem, and saying, "Is this the cleverest way to get there?" Right? Is there some, yeah, is there some super trick, or not even trick? It's like one of the most valuable classes I ever had as an undergrad was from this person, Whittam, Professor Whittam, and his takeaway was, if you charge forward and just hammer at things, you can waste a lot of energy, right? And if you back up and you think about them a bit, that sometimes you can see a connection. And even things as simple as trigonometry, if you charge into it and try and expand it the wrong way, you can go down a path that'll be 10 or 20 pages of algebra, and you'll be very lucky if you find your way out of it. But if you back up and think about it a little differently, sometimes you find that you can just add a value to it. And by doing a minor simple manipulation, you change the problem, you just transformatively change the problem, and can all of a sudden do it in 2 lines, right? That kind of thing. And so I think that thinking is key. Questioning, have I looked at this? Have I used all the sources of information? Am I getting, like, is this the best way to do this? Or is this an optimal way to do it? Anyway.
Yeah. So one of the skills that you use is coding. What applications might information technology and computer science have in research at the Institute and in the field as a whole?
Okay. So one of the things I work on is just very simplistically is how do we read our images, right? They come in proprietary company image formats. And so I maintain one of the libraries that reads these, and that we've then wrapped with a software package to make it easier for data scientists and just people to explore the data on their own, right? And so that's been that's one of the places where it definitely plays in, and that's the most simplistic. I've also worked with teammates and on teams where we've done things like to me, the more impressive things that's come out of the Institute is a technique called label free. And so what this is you tag a structure with a fluorescent protein, right? And you image it. And then the gist of that is that you end up with, you have an input image, you acquire a white light image and a fluorescent image. And the fluorescent image shows the structure that you care about, and the white light image is just a white light image of the cell. And you can train a neural network in many cases, to recognize that structure in the white light image. And then you can do one of these for a ton of different ones, and then you can composite them. So you can take one white light image and apply 20 filters to it and see all the different pieces of that cell in that image. And that's an experiment that's technically impossible, because if you were to try and use laser light to illuminate 20 different structures, 1, you'd run out of fluorescent tags possibly. 2, you'd end up with cooking the cell, because you're exposing it to so much laser light to excite that fluorescent protein. And so that's one of the most interesting things I think we've come up with. Yeah.
So you've spoken a little bit about how you got into science.
Mm-hmm.
So we have somebody who asked, how long did it take for you to realize that this was what you wanted to do? And that a lot of teens don't know what they want to do until later in their high school journey or beyond.
Yeah. The gist of it was, let's see. So for me, as a kid, I was diagnosed pretty early on as dyslexic. And so I gravitated towards math and science. And it was like, I have great respect for anybody who's strong in English or history or like liberal arts, right? But I don't, those are not skills that I particularly have. And so I gravitated that way naturally. But although I had an interest and I pursued it, it was not a clear-cut path. It was, there is a degree of a random walk, and I would say that it's not like that's something you shouldn't be afraid of. Don't be afraid of it having a degree of randomness. Some of the most interesting people I've worked with definitely don't seem to, like they just chase interesting problems in the moment that seems interesting to them, and they pursue it. And so, yeah, that would be my advice. Don't look the challenge is the further you look down the pipeline and that you want to be here or there or wherever, the harder it is to constrain reality to do that. But if you pursue interesting tools and like things that you think are interesting to learn, techniques, things that questions that excite you, that can be like, I think that's one of the most beneficial rewards. It keeps your life interesting and varied. And there aren't to my sense, there aren't a lot of jobs that give you that opportunity. So.
So you've spoken a little bit about the advice that you'd give to students. Can you explain something that you wish you had known when you were a student about a career in science? Maybe something that people don't know too much about how the world of science is as a professional.
Sure. One field, like for example, that I didn't really get exposed to at all until maybe even after grad school. A little bit in grad school, but not really. Like fisheries, for example, forestry and fisheries, like modeling these systems, right? So, like there are institutes around the world that work on how do we feed ourselves, using, like, we raise cattle, right, for agriculture. For how do you do the same for aquaculture and do it in such a way that you don't pollute, your that it's viable, right? And so that's a fascinating area with a lot of very practical constraints, but also it's an area where you use a lot of math and yeah, in inquisitiveness can get you a long way as well. Yeah.
We have time for a couple more questions, students. So if you have anything else that you'd like to add, please put it into the Q&A panel. While we wait for more questions to appear, can you tell us about what you like to do outside of work?
Sure. So in college, I lettered in swimming and diving and water polo. I still play water polo. Well, not during the pandemic, but up until the pandemic, I play water polo regularly with a master's team. So that's a lot of fun. Something exciting to do. And then, yeah, just project that I'm working on right now is pretty much like designing and building a house, which is kind of different and challenging. But yeah, so.
Well, that's exciting. So do you have, what do you wish more people understood about your field? So you work actually at the intersection of several fields. Yeah. So maybe you can speak to that as well.
Yeah, I would say that is actually, so I think I saw a question pop up that was like, what's a piece of value of information that was of great value that you were told? And one of them is pick two fields that you like and look at the intersection of them, because it's where the low-lying fruit is, meaning that it's easiest to make a contribution there. If you, like, as an applied mathematician type, right, you could go and do fluid mechanics, which is a really interesting deep field, but there's 300 years worth of work in that field. And to make a contribution, to find something novel, you really have to dig. And so you have to basically trawl through 300 years worth of work to get up to speed. And then you can start looking for new stuff. So.
We just had another question come in from a student. Was it hard to find a career as a scientist after college, or in your case, after grad school?
So I would say that's one of the, like, if you apply yourself and you pick up analytic skills, it's something that is very, it's very translatable. You can, if I've had colleagues or friends who've gone down the path of consulting management, because if you have analytic skills and you're mathematically inclined, it's generally not that hard to find a job. It's not always easy, but generally speaking, it's kind of an unusual path to pick. Statistically speaking, let's say, being well-versed in math isn't that common. And so if you've chosen to do that, that's generally of value. So especially if you combine it with something else that you're interested in. Like, yeah.
That is a great answer. Before you committed to this field, someone asked, did you consider anything in other job opportunities? Did you consider other career pathways?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, I looked at cooking professionally. Turns out for me, it's better as a hobby, but yeah, so.
Oh, that's so cool. Well, we are coming almost to the end of our time. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my one sense would be, it's the best thing you can do is be curious and inquisitive about the world. Chase that down as best you can. There are always challenges that come up. It's a good way to interact. And one of the things I really enjoy about science is the diversity of it, diversity of people, the diversity of perspectives, and that is, it's a value, right? That's how you get somewhere. So, yeah.
Well, we are just about out of time. We have one final question from an audience member, which is, this isn't a question, but thank you for taking the time to do this webinar. So I think from many of the audience members, I will pass that on. Thank you. And thank you all for attending today. This was Behind the Scenes of Science from the Allen Institute. Please go ahead to our YouTube channel and check out other webinars in the series to learn about other career paths in science. And thank you, Jamie, for speaking to our audience today.
So thanks everyone for showing up, and yeah, it'd be fun to interact in person, but that'll be another day.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.